We are living through a historic uprising against systemic racism and a white supremacist in the White House threatening to deploy the most powerful military in history to put that unrest down. My next guest couldn't be better positioned to think with us about this complicated time. He is a highly accomplished lawyer, a trailblazer in the Black community who claims the same alma mater as Dr. King, Morehouse College, which he attended alongside his friend, Martin Luther King III. He also worked for the Defense Department that Dr. King so vociferously condemned, and later served the nation's first Black president, Barack Obama, as his Secretary of Homeland Security. Taking a seat at the table, former Secretary Jeh Johnson. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anand, thank you for having me. Been looking forward to our discussion.
You know, I'm wondering how this last week has affected you personally. You have called yourself an imperfect disciple of Dr. King. You've had a front row seat to history with the Obama presidency, something that may have seemed impossible earlier in your own life. You're also a Black man who said you've had your own run-ins with the police. And you've been the head of America's massive security apparatus, a cop's cop. How have you processed everything that's going on?
Anand, let me begin with this. In my life's experience, in my time in public service, I've learned that there are very few things black and white, literally and figuratively, and that the world is filled with nuance. There are good cops and there are bad cops. There are peaceful protest and there are violent protest. It is difficult in a large, complicated world to paint things with a broad brush. I looked at the video of George Floyd's death and reacted as a Black man, as an African American, and as an American. You see a representative of our nation's law enforcement literally stomping out the life of a fellow citizen as if the cop were the hunter and Mr. Floyd was an animal whose life had to be snuffed. And I feel as though this is a moment when much of Black America is saying to all the rest of this nation, do you finally see what we've been talking about when we say Black Lives Matter and I can't breathe? That has been the rallying cry for the movement for at least the last 6 years since Staten Island and Eric Garner. And just as a human being, as a Black man, as an American, as a father of two, I'm deeply offended, and I believe that it is incumbent upon all Americans of goodwill to be equally as offended. And I hope we're seeing that. This could be, Anand, a turning point moment, much like the display of Emmett Till's mutilated body in 1955 in an open casket funeral after he was lynched, or the grainy black and white film of demonstrators being fire hosed in Birmingham, Alabama. I hope that this is a moment that finally makes a difference. I have reason to be skeptical, given that we've seen so many instances in recent times when we thought this is finally the moment, after Sandy Hook, after Parkland, when we're finally going to have gun safety reform, and we just don't seem to get there. But I've learned to be an optimist.
When you look at, you talk about looking at the video of George Floyd, and there's so many other cases, recently and not so recent. I want to get your thoughts on the question of how systemic you feel this is. If you pay attention to what people are saying on television or on Twitter, there's a view out there that this is a bad apples problem. There's an acknowledgement that there are maybe a significant number of people who behave in this way, but it's not all of them, and that we need to find the bad apples, we need to have better investigations, but fundamentally bad apples. But I wonder where you think the truth falls in the spectrum between this is solely a problem of bad apples versus there is something universally wrong in our police forces when we're seeing not just these killings, but so many of the interactions across this country in state after state this week, handling peaceful people, beating people for no reason. Do you think we have an all cops problem that we need to think seriously about as a country?
it is difficult for me or anybody else to try to quantify the extent of this problem. A couple of thoughts, though. It's not a deep South problem. It's not a red state problem. Minneapolis is a blue city in a blue state, as you know. The two other things that occur to me in answer to your question, every time I see an, an incident of excessive police force caught on an iPhone camera, I ask myself, how many such instances are there that are not caught on an iPhone camera? And think about all the times when something like this occurred before people didn't carry iPhones around in their pocket. You noted at the outset that there seems to be a rise in these kinds of incidents. I tend to believe that they're just simply a rise in the instance in which they are filmed. Now, I don't say that there's systemic racism across police forces of America.
You don't think there's systemic racism across America's police
Well,
forces?
let me get to what my point is here. Throughout my adult life, I've rarely simply branded something or somebody racist. I do believe we have the following systemic problem. I believe that there is a systemic problem in how and who we are recruiting to police forces across America. I believe that rather than recruiting people who want to protect and serve the public, we are recruiting far too many people who want to be the neighborhood badass, the neighborhood bully, and perhaps even the neighborhood racist. And that was on full display with what happened in Minneapolis. There is no level of training or orientation or no oath to the Constitution that someone can take that could eradicate that kind of depravity from somebody's existence. So I believe that if we are to look hard at the solution to this problem, we need to look hard at the type of people police forces are recruiting. Some are racist, some are badasses, some simply do not have the character and the temperament to be peace officers.
Do you think, you're someone who, in part because you're maybe a little more measured than I am, someone the president might be willing to listen to. Have you ever had success influencing his ability to see these things?
I have, on occasion, had an opportunity to consult with President Trump. I cannot tell you. One such meeting was during the transition in 2016. Cameras were in the lobby of Trump Tower, and everybody saw me going up to his office, and press was all, "Why is he going there? Why is he going there?" I've had occasion to consult him on some things, and I cannot tell you whether he has acted in conformity with my advice. On one or two occasions, he seems to have acted parallel to my advice. How's that? How's that for a measured answer? But somebody like Donald Trump, there's a certain way, I believe, to talk to an individual like that. Somebody once said to me, somebody who previously was in his White House said to me, you have to, if you want to pitch a good idea, you got to make him believe it's his idea. So there's a manner in which you counsel somebody with that kind of temperament. And I wrote an op-ed a couple years ago about the DACA kids. Mr. President, save DACA. Here's your chance to do something great for immigration reform. Save DACA, protect these kids. You said they were good kids. This is an opportunity for you to tell your Attorney General what to do. Tell your Attorney General to defend these cases in court. It was at a moment when I knew he was very frustrated with Jeff Sessions, and he was frustrated that he has a lawyer working for him. He's not supposed to tell him what to do. And I said in the op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, this is an opportunity for you to tell Jeff Sessions what to do, to try to appeal to him on his level. It obviously did not work because we are where we are. with the DACA program.
You're a lawyer, you.
Part of lawyering, by the way, is understanding the person on the receiving end so that your advice is heard.
So when the president threatens to invoke the Insurrection Act, effectively declares war on citizens exhibiting their First Amendment rights, as a careful, measured lawyer, do you nonetheless think we are getting into the kind of dangerous territory of authoritarianism that many people have been talking about in recent days?
Yes, my unqualified answer is yes. We are getting into dangerous territory. The Insurrection Act of 1807 was signed by Thomas Jefferson at a time when there was no standing army of the United States, at a time when state law enforcement was not robust. And it is a measure of last resort when the state apparatus of government, the state apparatus of law enforcement, the state court system has effectively broken down, and the states are incapable of doing what they need to do. Various historians have cited that the Insurrection Act was invoked in the South in the 50s and 60s during integration. That's because you needed the federalized National Guard to enforce a federal court order. But it is a measure of last resort. And one of the reasons I think you've seen the retired four-star military leadership react so strongly to this, they're not lawyers. They don't understand the nuances of the Insurrection Act, but it's part of their core values that you don't deploy the active duty military to the streets of the United States. And one of the reasons we respect and revere our military so much in this country is because we keep it cabined. We prevent the power and the reach of our military, which is the most powerful military force in the world, from reaching into domestic society and civilian life. And so you see people like Dempsey and Mullen and Mattis reacting very strongly to even the threat of invoking the Insurrection Act.
Tell me about the first protest for racial justice that you remember going to and how it affected you.
It was 1977, I believe. And I was a Morehouse College student. By the way, over my right shoulder, you might not be able to see it. It's a small black and white photograph. Is a picture of Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, President Emeritus of Morehouse College. He was and is the inspiration for just about every Morehouse man that graduated from Morehouse anywhere between the 1940s and the 1970s. That encompasses both me and Martin Luther King, who was class of 1948. Dr. Mays gave the eulogy at Dr. King's funeral. It was a remarkable eulogy. But first time I ever got involved in a march, it was 1977, I believe. Marty, my classmate, invited me to his mother's house on Sunset Avenue in Southwest Atlanta. I sat there in the living room with other Morehouse Spelman students with Mrs. King, and we planned a march to the Georgia State Capitol for a holiday on Dr. King's birthday. And I participated, and I felt remarkably good after that experience.
I'm curious, given your proximity to those events, Dr. King was the most strident critic of systemic racism perhaps this country's ever had. I wonder why you don't see, whether it's in the police force, I don't know if you would say more broadly, systemic racism as the issue that's being revealed right now.
I'm not going to put that label on the entire community of law enforcement across the United States, first of all, without a definition of what you would consider systemic racism. But
doesn't it just mean not every person doing bad things, but the systems in which they're operating are permeated through and through with racism? The practices, the hiring practices you talked about, who gets to be a cop, the way they police in certain communities. None of these things are products of the whims of individuals. That you have been, harassed by the police in your lifetime. I think I'm a little darker than you, but I'm not black. I have never been harassed by the police. It's not an accident, right? Isn't that the essence of there being systemic racism?
Well, depending upon how you define systemic racism, I suppose one could say there's systemic racism across this entire country, across all institutions of this entire country, across the legal profession, across law enforcement, across mental health, across the way in which COVID is impacting American life right now. I'm simply not prepared to embrace the phrase the way I think most people in today's debate mean it. From my experience in law enforcement, I think a more meaningful solution and a more meaningful way to express the nature of the problem is to talk about the nature of the type of people we are recruiting to wear a badge and carry a gun. That is something that police commissioners and police chiefs can do something about tomorrow. And I believe that is a ready solution to the problems we face, many of which are incidents clearly in racism.
There's been a lot of talk this week of the talk that many African American parents have with their children, with the important disclosure that one of your children works as a producer on this show. Have you ever given your kids the talk?
Yes, I have. I have given my daughter, the producer, a talk. She has given me a talk. I know what I don't know. She's a millennial. I am not. One of the most instructive moments for me in the last 6 years during the Black Lives Matter movement was I saw a photograph of a young woman wearing a T-shirt that says, "This is not your grandmother's civil rights movement. It's fundamentally different." So those of us who grew up in the civil rights era, or like me, a little bit after the civil rights era, have to embrace a different way of thinking about the problems we face today. But I've had this conversation with my daughter. I've had this conversation with my son, who wears the uniform of our country. My daughter and my son are two very different people, so it's been different types of conversations. But yes, it's the type of conversation that a father who is also an African American in this country should have with his children. Absolutely.
In retrospect, do you think the Obama administration in which you served was tough enough on the intersecting and kind of gathering crises of white supremacy and abusive law enforcement?
Yes, I would say so, given what we knew at the time. It's very difficult, Anand, when you're in the midst of something to see the larger picture gathering around you, to see the trend lines. When I was Secretary of Homeland Security, we were facing homegrown, homeborn violent extremism that was domestic inspired and foreign inspired. And you'll remember those terrorist attacks like anybody else. We were also facing, as a security matter, Al Qaeda, AQAP, the Islamic State overseas. And then, of course, we had incidents like Ferguson in 2014. And there's a defined life to every presidency and every administration. 4 years or even 8 years is not a lot of time to solve the more deep-rooted ills of our society. And so very often the solutions to these problems must be on a continuum of multiple administrations. This administration, however, seems to be wanting to take multiple steps backward in the opposite direction.
I want to see if you can solve a mystery for us that has been perplexing a lot of seasoned observers of Washington, of the country's security apparatus. there have been in recent days in Washington, as you've no doubt seen, a bunch of police, secret police, people are calling them, the people that don't bear any insignia, and people are not sure what part of the government they're actually from. They're refusing to answer questions about who they work for. There's some suspicion that they're part of Bill Barr's Department of Justice force. Sort of feels like a new thing going on. Do you have any idea who these folks are, and how should we understand what is going on with the deployment of what some are calling an American secret police?
Good question. The Department of Homeland Security is actually the largest collection of federal law enforcement officers of any cabinet level department, larger than the Department of Justice. Between the Border Patrol, the customs agents, Secret Service, the Federal Protective Service, and a bunch of other agencies. I am very disturbed and troubled that in any circumstance, like engaging people on the streets of Washington, D.C. or in Lafayette Park, federal law enforcement officers would remove their credentials.
Is it illegal?
Is it illegal? It's probably not illegal. I think it is unconventional and wrong. The only circumstance where I have observed someone taking off their credentials, who they are, something identifying that it identifies you as a law enforcement officer or a military member, is in, say, a detention facility or some sort of special ops. I do not believe that it is appropriate for law enforcement officers to take off their credentials, take off their agency emblem, so you don't know who you're engaging. It's a matter of authenticity. And if we go down that road, then you could see the rise of all sorts of, quasi forces, militias, and people who want to pretend to be cops. And so that's why we tell law enforcement officers, peace officers, you got to wear your credentials, you got to wear your badge, so we see who you are. There are circumstances on the battlefield overseas where not wearing the appropriate military attire, including what nation you represent, violates laws of armed conflict. And so it's kind of fundamental. And I cannot foresee, I'm almost certain we never had such a circumstance when I was in government. And I could not see a circumstance where if I were Secretary of Homeland Security, I would condone such a thing.
Some of those people in Washington right now probably were still there and served under you. Would you call on them as individuals to defy the order, to mask who they work for and who they are?
Not unless it was an illegal order. My phone call, had I known such a thing was coming, would be to higher sources of authority, like my successor, for example, who's in acting capacity, which means he's living day to day in this administration, like a whole lot of other people. But that's a call that I would make to people who are in a position to change the directive for everybody.
Before I let you go, later in the show, we're talking to a panel of civil servants from the NIH, Veterans Affairs, and the Postal Service about the importance of government work. You've spent much of your career in the public sector. What is your pitch to young people, including people on the street right now, who have grown up in a country that has shown them dysfunctional government, that has deified the private sector? What's your pitch to them about making a life in public service, particularly given the moment we're in?
A couple of things. One, administrations do come and go. Administrations come and go in a matter of 4 or 8 years. Well, the Constitution says so. Second, day to day, something like 97, 98, 95% of the work of government goes on irrespective of the administration in power. I've seen that in the Pentagon, among the civilian workforce at DHS. So the day-to-day work, or in various U.S. attorneys' offices, the administration sets broad policy parameters. There are people who worked for me as political appointees who are now civil servants in the current government, whose work day to day is unaffected by the fact that it's Trump and not Clinton. Third, we cannot allow ourselves to be optimistic about the future of this country unless qualified young people are willing to serve the country once they're able to do so. And so I have, in my post-government private life, no matter how dark and bad things seem to get, so no matter how disenchanting things seem to get, I have continued to encourage young people, young law students, young associates in my firm to think about a career in public service. Our government, our democracy is strong enough to sustain crises like the ones we're facing now.
Well, former Secretary Jeh Johnson, thank you so much for taking a seat at the table.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.